Great. Good morning, everyone. It's really great to see everyone here. We're so thrilled to be starting to have some of our programs return to the COA. Our speaker this morning, many of you have already met him, is Herb Crean, and he's visited us a number of times, and he's an authority on Boston baseball history. For the past 25 seasons, he has interviewed and written feature articles on over 150 former Red Sox players. His articles appear in the team's official game day program. Today he's going to speak to us on Boston baseball stadiums and players who grew up locally and went on to play for the Red Sox. So please welcome Herb Crean.
Thank you very much. It's great to be back. I've always enjoyed my visits here, and I've been here a number of times. And it's nice that we can at least gather together. It was so tough a year ago. And I did a number of Zooms, but it's just not the same for anybody. But so absolutely welcome. And I went to my first Red Sox game in 1952.
Oh, I went before you.
Well, that was going to be my next question. You know a little bit about me. So this is my 70th consecutive year, with the asterisk that last year I went as a cardboard cutter. I was up in the cream monster. But I had to keep that intact, 70 straight years. And somebody asked me the other day, how do you become a baseball historian or a historian of anything? And I said, well, getting older surely helps. Because we're all smarter now than we were 10 years ago or 20, right? There's that. But also, I got to see 8 years of Ted Williams' 17 season, almost half. Now, the first 9 were better than the last 8, but there was only one Ted. How many of you got to see him in person? You must have.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, well, that's good. And what I remember best is my mother taking me to a game. I was probably 10 years old, something like that. And Ted came up in the 8th inning, and he always did something dramatic, even if he struck out. Or he hit a long fly ball right in front of the bullpen. And so here it is, the 8th inning. The Red Sox are ahead by 5 runs. And after Ted hit, most of the people got up and left. Oh. And I said to my mother, being 10 years old, well, where are they going? The game's not over. How can they be? She said, well, they came to see Ted Williams. I don't know if we're ever going to see anything quite like that. And I was there when he made an error in the outfield. The game went 11 innings. And between the error in the 8th inning and the 11th, when it ended, he managed to spit at the fan several times, which only one guy could get away with that. And then, so he comes up, bases are loaded. It's actually tied 0-0. And the pitcher threw 4 straight balls. Even in that situation, he didn't want to take a chance. And Ted was so mad he didn't get the hit. He threw his bat up, must have been at least 50, 60 feet in the air.
Yeah, the tempo.
And so I really don't think we'll ever see anybody quite like him again. Yeah. So I went in 1952. When did you go?
I went in 1949.
Wow. Good for you.
In the 8th grade. The first half of the 8th grade. My friend's mother took us out to the bleachers there. I think it was 50 cents.
Probably, well, yeah.
Oh, we were looking for boys, because we went to an all-Catholic school, so we used to follow boys play Little League and all that, So we were into baseball quite a bit. But my father took me to Mechanics Hall.
Oh,
and I saw Ted Williams there. Reeling there.
So you remember Mechanics Hall? I mean, it's been gone forever and a day, but they had the sportsman show every winter.
Yeah, that's what we
did. And Ted was, of course, the featured guest. And a lot lot of people said he was better at fishing than he was at baseball.
Hall of Fame, you know.
Right. And the other thing, you don't see it widely publicized, and I can share some stories I wouldn't write, but universally his teammates said he was the most profane man they ever met in their life.
Yeah.
He could not get through a sentence without some. In fact, Joanne Susie, who lives in Natick, her husband pitched for the Red Sox for 5 or 6 years, and her husband was a great fisherman, so they went to visit Ted out in the Keys. And the fact that there were 3 little kids running around didn't influence him at all. She said, I had my hands over their ears. I go, George, we have to get away from this.
He was handsome, though.
Oh, yeah, he was, I mean, he had so many different things going for him. But, one of his teammates told, Milt Fuller told me that he would be talking to Ted, and he'd finally say, Ted, I have to walk away. I'm afraid I'm going to get struck by a bolt of lightning. And actually, probably the most important thing that I have to offer is the fact that I'm just a fan like all of you. I decided I was going to make myself a historian, and I'm very fortunate that it worked out, and particularly fortunate to have met 150 former players who made this history. And, as I say, I can't publish everything they said. It actually comes in like 3 forms. One would be talking, knowing I was going to play. The second would be, I'm going to give you some information on deep background because it'll help you understand. But I prefer you didn't put it in the article and tell me about somebody's drinking problem or whatever. And then the third was, I'm going to tell you this, but if you ever quote me, I'm going to deny you said it, and I'm going to tell every other former Red Sox player, don't talk to that guy. So you can imagine what those stories are. I didn't even tell my wife that. Unless it was funny and harmless, and I knew she wasn't going to tell anybody anyway. So I've been very fortunate that way. So we're going to talk about Fenway Park, and I think all of us tend to think of Fenway as the baseball stadium, and certainly it has been for the last 70 years. But it's only one of 8, and we'll talk a little bit about all 8. And not only that, it isn't even the most recently built baseball stadium. How many of you remember the Boston Braves?
Oh, I've been there.
Yeah. Hey, did you go to Braves Field?
Yeah.
Yeah. Fenway, and we'll see this as we go through it. Fenway was built in 1912. Braves Field was built in 1915. So it was actually newer. And if you're driving into Boston and go by Boston University and you look to your right, there's still remnants of that's where Braves Field was. And one of the pavilions still stands, and they use that for fans to watch the soccer games or whatever else is going on. And where the security people are was the old front office for the Boston Braves.
Oh.
And one of my favorite stories, and a lot of you remember, in 1953, they went to spring training as the Boston Braves, and they left as the Milwaukee Braves. And they had already, as you might imagine, since it was in the middle of March, already printed up the tickets for the 1953 season at Braves Field. And I have a picture, it's not in the, of them burning them, which I'm not quite sure why they felt they had, I don't know, maybe hard to know, but they burned all those things. Now, there are people who manage to sneak some tickets, and they reappear on eBay or the like over time. And so, yeah, they were actually here 82 years, 82 seasons. And in fact, if you're very observant, when the Atlanta Braves were here, they had a patch on their uniform that said 150. And that was the 150th anniversary of the Boston Red Sox.
Oh.
Yeah. It's kind of ironic, really. And they're celebrating the 150th. But the more important thing is, this is the 151st consecutive season with a professional baseball team. And that's the most in the United States, in North America, possibly for a professional sports team, and specifically for a Major League Baseball team. 151 consecutive, that's the most of any city. Chicago's second at 149, and the main reason they're not 151 was in the second year, Mrs. O'Leary's cow allegedly started the fire, but they had more important things to do in 1872 than rebuild the baseball stadium. So they were there in 1871, just like the Braves. They didn't play in 18. So in terms of the consecutive years, we hold the record. So if you look very closely, I'm right up there. I'm kidding. I really am up there. But I thought even with a magnet you wouldn't find me. And this is the end of Game 6 in 2013. The Red Sox have just won Game 6 against the St. Louis Cardinals, and they've won the World Championship. And the important thing is, it was the first time that the Red Sox had won the World Championship at home since 1918. And you know, that's still the case because we obviously won in 2018, but that was won in Dodger Stadium.
I went to the first game of the World Series.
Which World Series?
The 2013.
Did you? Yeah.
$250.
Yeah.
But my son had the tickets, and my neighbor wanted to go in the worst way, so he sold them to us for what he paid for them.
Oh, well,
So
that's
I
nice.
just want to mention one thing, Herb, if I may.
course,
We
please.
are recording this for Waycam so that we can show it on cable later on. So we thought maybe we could just save all the questions for the end, just so that we can do that after we finish the recording.
That's
Sorry.
absolutely fine. And I think most of you know who that is. How
Tony
many?
Canigliaro.
Yeah, right. And when we talk about players who grew up locally, he's one of the very first, if not the first, who comes to mind. And we're going to talk about Babe Ruth a little later, so to listen carefully, because I have the Whalen connection of the Babe, as well as an original Babe Ruth quote, which pretty tough to come by these days. Secondhand, I'll admit. But so here's Tony C., who a lot of you know. He actually grew up as a youngster in East Boston. They moved to Swampscott, and in high school he played for St. Mary's of Lynn. And so one year, there he is, a starting center fielder for St. Mary's of Lynn, and 2 years later he was a starting center fielder for the Boston Red Sox. 1964. And I talked to Johnny Pesky, who was the manager that year, about Tony, and he went to spring training after just 1 year in the minor league system. And he did so well that, as Johnny put it, I had to keep him because the fans would have been so upset with me if I didn't, that I'd be in big trouble. But he instantly was successful. And we'll talk a little bit more about Tony later. So first we're going to do the ballparks, and then we'll go on to the players.
This one, right? Oh, okay, sorry.
We just want to be sure you're all paying attention. So the south end grounds were located behind Northeastern. I think probably a lot of you, maybe most of you, know where Northeastern is located on Huntington Avenue, in between the Symphony Hall and the Museum of Fine Arts. And so it was on the other side of the railroad tracks, and technically the south end, or Roxbury. And I mentioned 1871 was when the Boston Red Stockings, they were called, first played, and they were in the National Association, which lasted for 5 years, and was succeeded by the National League, which still exists all these years later. In my mind, that's the prettiest stadium we've ever had in Boston. Apologies to Fenway Park. But I've seen a real model of what it was like. And I mean, it's got the turrets like Churchill Dam, and it's the only two-story, two-deck stadium we've ever had. And you can see the second deck is up here. And it was built in 1884. South End Grounds 1 was just sort of thrown together, and the game was so popular that they built a brand new stadium, and a beautiful stadium. Unfortunately, it burned down because a fan supposedly threw a cigar over his shoulder. It started a little fire, and by the time they put out the fire, it had destroyed like 10 blocks all in the area. It's known as the Great Roxbury Fire, and it started here in 1891, I believe. And that was it, unfortunately. Now, if we go on to one more, the Dartmouth Street grounds were right where Copley Place is now. I don't know if any of us can afford to go to Copley Place, but if you can, it was basically on that area. And I think that you can see it lasted for 5 years, 1884, 88. The most important point was that at that point in time was everybody was playing baseball. Not they were watching, obviously, but older people, young people, little kids, women, everybody was playing baseball. And that's what you always often hear, the national pastime. That's referring to the fact that everybody was doing it. And not so much that people crowded in the stadium. Although, you know, the first game in South End Grounds 1, there were 5,000 fans there.
Oh.
Yeah, that's a pretty good crowd for 1871. And of course, part of it was a novelty. And some of you are familiar with the Cincinnati team that barnstormed around the country, and they won like 90 straight games over 2 years, and went from city to city to city, played the local team, and won like 90 consecutive games. And so people turned out to see the unbeatable team. When they finally lost their first game, people stopped going because the novelty of unbeatable team had worn off. But in the different cities around where they had visited, people got very excited about a baseball team, and that's how the Boston Red Sox happened to be founded in 1871. And the owners, the names we'd all recognize, like had to be an Adams and all of the other names that are so familiar there. Leaders and Shakers got together at the Parker House, put up $10,000, bought a franchise, and lo and behold, they're the 1871 Boston Red Sox. And interesting, they were the Red Stockings, wearing the Red Stockings all the way through 1908, and for some reason, the owner decided to get rid of the Red Sox and go to blue. And when they did that, the Boston Americans changed their name to the Boston Red Sox.
Oh.
So the first 7 seasons of their existence, they were the Boston Americans. And in fact, team names, nicknames, didn't really become official until around 1910. And for example, the Braves' name was adopted in 1912. And remained the Braves, except for a brief period of 5 years when they became the Boston Bees, as in buzz. They were so bad and there was so little interest, they ran a contest inviting people to rename them. And that was the best they could do. And didn't help much anything, so they went back to the Braves 5 years after that. And it's been the Braves ever since. So let's take a look. Now, this is important. This is down on the waterfront, the only waterfront stadium we've ever had. And to cite it, was kind of across from where the ICA is now, near the courthouse. You know, it went for years and years, it was just a parking lot. So when South End Grounds 2 burnt down, they were able to move to the Congress Street grounds because they already existed for another purpose. And so they finished the season at the Congress Street grounds. And the next year they came back to what was South End Grounds 3, which was almost like South End Grounds 1. It was sort of thrown together because it needed a place to play. But baseball was so popular in this 1880 to almost 1900 that different leagues sprung up, the Federal League, the Union League, and in some cases folded after a year. The American Association actually lasted 10 years, and baseball historians accept that as a major league. And in fact, the first African-American player played in the American Association. And then everybody got together and came up with a gentleman's agreement. How in the world you could call it a gentleman's agreement is a different issue, but that there would not be any. Everybody just agreed we're not going to have any players of color. And so they being the owners and the establishment, always said, well, we haven't banned players of color. It just hasn't happened that any of them were good enough to play for us, and a lot of other nonsense. But I think it was 1882, the first African-American player. He played one season, and they all got together and said, we can't have any of that. So, and the next slide is of a more modern stadium.
Wow.
So at this point, there have now been 5 stadiums, the 3 South End Grounds, the Congress Street and the Dartmouth Street. In 1901, the American League was started, and what we now know as the Red Sox were charter members. Not a whole lot of them are still there in the same place. The New York Yankees are not charter members in the sense. They actually moved to New York in 1903. First 2 years they were the Baltimore Orioles, in part because the American League, just starting out, wasn't sure they could compete in New York. Already a huge city and already had 2 teams, what we know as the Giants and the Dodgers. So they played 2 years in Baltimore and moved in 1903 to New York. And it was 50 years before anybody else moved. And we talked about it briefly earlier. 1953, the Braves packed up and moved to Milwaukee. And after about 20 years in Milwaukee, they moved to Atlanta. So they are the oldest continuing franchise in this 151st season. Now the people in Cincinnati would dispute that because they did have that team barnstorming around 1869, 1870. But then that dissolved, and in fact, most of their big stars came here to Boston to play for the Red Stockings. So their claim is bogus. Don't pay any attention. So here we are. Oh, let's go back just for a minute if we could. Now we're actually on the grounds of Northeastern. Does it help if I show you?
I can see it then.
Okay. And if you drive by Northeast, go down Huntington Avenue, and you see the huge gymnasium called the Cage. This stadium was located on that particular spot. And it was the Boston Americans till 1908, as we talked, and through 1911, they played right here. Then we talked about Mechanics Hall. This is the old Opera House. Right?
Oh yeah, I've been there.
Imagine that. Really? Yeah, because Northeastern tore it down and put in a parking lot and preceded Joni Mitchell, I guess, It held as many as 12,000 people with people standing, with 10,000 seats. And to this point, until we get to Fenway, they're all made of wood, so they're all susceptible to possibly burning down, as well as deteriorating. So when Fenway was built in 1912, you know, Dean Shaughnessy and others will say there wasn't a big story about it because the Titanic sank and that dominated all the news. And there's some truth to that. But think about it, it was the 7th stadium built in a period of you know, about 40 years. So it was not really a big event from the public's point of view. I think what's particularly interesting is that was the site of the first World Series, played in 1903 against the Pittsburgh Pirates from the National League. The American League challenged them. The National League said, "Oh, sure, we'll do that." But, you know, saying to themselves, we've been around for over 30 years, they don't have a chance. And the Boston Americans prevailed 5-3. The first World Series and several after that was best of 9. And then they realized, you know, that was really too much until, and this is important, until 1919 when the owner said, let's go back to that 9-game series and we'll keep all the money for the extra 2 games. And that, of course, was the year of the Chicago Black Sox, and part of their discontent there being the Chicago White Sox, later known as Black Sox, through the games because they were bitter about not getting paid for the extra 2 games. And we'll come back to that because Babe Ruth is now going to play a big part in that. And that's something else I should mention. Until 1919, gambling was a really big deal in going to watch a baseball game. And, you know, without formally, you know, recognizing the owners, let bookies have little stands all up surrounding the ballpark. And, you know, you think about it, there was no Foxwood, there was no state lottery, you know, there was not even a Suffolk, not even a horse racing. So this is it. If you wanted to bet, you went to the baseball games. And that led, long before the 1919 Black Sox, that led to concerns about players wagering and affecting it. So in 1903, the first World Series was played here, and of local interest, the American League umpire was Tom Conley, who lived on Wilson Street in Natick. And he, in fact, was the very first American League umpire when it was started. And in those days, there was only one umpire. So a lot of people running from first to third if the umpire was distracted. It was pretty tough to keep track of everything going on. But the World Series was such a big deal, they said, we'll go to 2. And there was one from the National League. In fact, you can see one of them there. And this is the second umpire. And so that was a big deal. Two umpires. And Tom represented the American League. So this team was so popular that it did 2 things. One, it really was a problem for the Boston Braves. By then, they're known as the Boston Bean Eaters. But people liked the American League team better, the team that became the Red Sox. And part of it was the Bean Eaters charged $1 to go to the game, and the Boston American charged 50 cents. So it was twice as much to go see a bad team because the Boston Braves teams in the early 1900 were not very good at all. So the fandom shifted immediately to the Boston Americans. In 1912, they opened Fenway Park, and it's called Fenway Park because it's in the Fenway area, and it was as simple as that. The owner was asked, what should we call it? He said, well, it's in the Fenway, so we'll call it Fenway Park. And so here we are in 1912, and this picture is taken from the third base side. When the ballpark opened, there were no stands along the third base line, and the original capacity was about 24,000. And things were so popular, particularly for the World Series, that they put in the third base seats. And if you've been to a game, really pay attention, you'll see the whole third base thing looks a little odd in terms of it juts out into the field, and that's because it was sort of pulled together for the World Series. This is you see the gap there. That's what we call Canvas Alley. That's where the grounds crew sits. Except that originally it was really, really wide. You can't tell that from this angle. When Tom Yawkey bought the ball club in 1933, he totally renovated the ballpark, but the original footprint was faithful. He modernized it and did all sorts of good things, but here we are. The punchline is he added 3 sections. I have seats in section 10. He added 11, 12, and 13, filling in a big chunk of that open space. And in fact, my seats are right about there, right under the giant glass piano that we saw earlier. So here we are, the Red Sox in their brand new stadium had an electronic scoreboard, which was unique at its time. And there actually was a 20-foot wall out in left field, predating the 37-foot green monster. Now, the Braves are still playing, and people aren't paying a lot of attention to them, except that in 1914, they were in last place in the middle of the year, middle of the season, right after the All-Star game, and they went from last place to first place over the second half of the season, and were named, and to this day are known as the Miracle Braves, the 1914 Braves. And they won the National League pennant, and they went on to win the World Series, much to everybody's surprise. But by then, South End Grounds was old, dilapidated, and they actually played the second half of their season in Fenway Park.
Oh my goodness.
And they played the 1914 World Series in Fenway Park. Now, along comes Braves Field, which was built 3 years after Fenway Park. And it actually was much bigger. It seated 42,000, where, at that point, Fenway is probably about 32,000. So 10,000 more seats. So in 1914, the Braves played in the Red Sox home. 1915, the Red Sox played in the Braves home, so they could sell 10,000 more tickets. and who could blame them? So that's giving you a sense of the size of the crowd if it was full, 42,000. And it was hailed as a great stadium, but all of a sudden the game was going to change from the dead ball era to the lively ball era. And this stadium was built for the dead ball era. So it was 550 feet to center field and 400 feet down the line. And it never really recovered from that beginning. Babe Ruth starts to hit home runs, and all of a sudden that's what people want to see. And it came along right at the time of the Black Sox scandal, when everybody in the United States was down on baseball. All of a sudden, here comes George Herman, Babe Ruth, and he introduces the home run, the ball hit into the stands. And all of a sudden, everybody forgot about the terrible scandal and focused on this new game, which is a lot more exciting. So now we're going to talk about local heroes. How many of you remember or have heard the name Harry Kiana? Yeah. He was, arguably the greatest schoolboy athlete in history, and was widely known. he went to Lynn Classical. It's kind of ironic. He and Tony both went to high school in Lynn. As I mentioned, St. Mary's for Tony and Lynn Classical. He went from there to Boston University, where he was an All-American quarterback. The only time that Boston University ever had a major football team was when Harry was a quarterback. But when he graduated from BU, he decided to take the Red Sox offer to become a professional baseball player because he thought there was too much chance of getting hurt playing football. He was ahead of his time that way. But as it turned out, in 1955, at the age of 26, Tony caught pneumonia. He was in Santa Maria Hospital across the river in Cambridge, and threw an embolism and died. And I've interviewed and gotten to know a lot of the players from the 1950s era, and they said, you know, they were just grief-stricken. It was, here we are in the middle of the season. And everybody loved Harry. Harry was a terrific athlete, local guy. And they were in Kansas City. And nobody thought he was in any sort of serious condition. Now, why he was at Santa Maria, well, the Red Sox physician had practicing rights there. So, and ironically, that's where they took Tony when he got beamed. You know, here we have Mass General, the Mass Eye in here. We have all of these world famous hospitals. They took him over to Santa Maria, which, you know. So let's look at so poor Harry, you know, to this day is, you know, the legend of Harry Kiana. And Boston University's hockey facility is Giannis Arena, named after Harry, who was the greatest athlete in the history of Boston University. One of my all-time favorites, Billy Monboquette, the pride of Medford, Mass. And I always say, I got to know him really, really well, and I always say he was the nicest, tough guy I ever met. Man, oh man, was he tough, but he was a perfect gentleman. You know, kind of the way, well, for a lot of us remember, that's the way good people were brought up in the 1940s, and you were a gentleman at all times. And so Billy was a pitcher, a very, very good pitcher. And one story to give you a sense of how tough he was. In those days, if the Red Sox were going to sign somebody to a minor league contract, they'd have them come in, and during batting practice, if they were a pitcher, they'd throw some batting practice. Part of it was to look at the skills, but I think really more, how did they fit in with everything? So Billy did that. Billy signed a contract to go up to Corning, New York, and play for the lowest level. And so Billy and his mother and father had great seats right behind the Red Sox dugout, and you know, kind of recognizing him. And so now this will be Billy's voice. He said, there are a couple of tough guys behind us, and they were swearing, and at one point we turned around and said, hey, there's a lady here. Watch it, which you would do in 1953 or 54. And then he said, the next thing that happened was they spilled beer on my mother. He said, I looked at my father looked at me, and the two of us got up and beat the daylights out of both of them. I mean, that's what you did also. Unfortunately, Billy got arrested because there was a bit of a disturbance. He said, you better call Mr. Murphy upstairs because I'm supposed to report to the Red Sox fan club tomorrow morning. So they were never charged, and they were released. But that's Billy. And after his career was over, he was a coach in the minor league systems for several different teams. And he actually spent the next 40 years in baseball. So by the time he retired at about age 70, he had been involved with professional baseball for over 50 years. He was a lifer. And he passed away a couple of years ago, and you know, I still miss him. He was one of the really good guys. Now, we talked about Harry Giannis in the late 50s and early 60s. Walter Ridiack was the best schoolboy athlete in eastern Massachusetts. He went to Natick High School, and he was probably the best high school quarterback, the best high school baseball player, and the best high school hockey player. You know, you think about 1959, see, most towns, most schools didn't have a hockey team at that point, but Natick did, and people said he was such a good athlete that he really could have potentially played professional hockey as well. He signed actually with the Braves, and he was in a terrible traffic accident while he was in the minors. And he did play a couple of years for the Braves, you can see 1968, but never achieved what he might have if he hadn't been in that accident. But then he became a hitting instructor, and he was with the Red Sox from 1977 to 1988, and Dwight Evans said he was the man who turned around Dwight's career, because in his first 10 years, his last 10 years, Dwight was a better hitter than he was in his first 10, which is very unusual, and he attributed it to Butch. Ted Williams, when he would watch Dwight Evans, said, the way Dwight Evans is at the plate makes me want to throw up. So that was the end of Butch Ridiack, because if Ted didn't like him, then that was a problem. He went from there to the Chicago White Sox, so he kept his socks on. And probably what's most interesting is he attempted to teach Michael Jordan how to hit a curveball. Oh. Some of you will remember that Michael took a year off, that's a whole different story, and decided to become a professional baseball player. And he spent a whole season in Double-A, which is, you know, kind of the middle of things, in Birmingham, Alabama. Anybody know who his manager was?
Terry Franklin.
Very, very good. Do we have something with a prize? That's great, yeah. Terry Franklin was the Birmingham team's manager. And Michael never did learn how to hit a curveball, but he was a wonderful athlete, obviously, and he was in great shape, obviously. But he could not hit a curveball. You know, Ted Williams always said it, that hitting a baseball and hitting it safely and for distance was the most difficult of any sports activity. Now, Jane Levy wrote a book about Mickey Mantle, and she said, no, Ted was absolutely wrong. The hardest, most difficult is to hit the ball safely and far, batting from both sides of the plate. You know, it's kind of hard to argue with. Not all that many players who made the Hall of Fame being switch hitters. So Walter's still around. He's up on the North Shore now. A really nice guy. He was a hitting coach in '86 when they went to the World Series. Now, the next guy didn't play for the Red Sox, but this is really interesting. Anybody remember that name? You do, yeah. Joe Coleman graduated from Natick High in 1965, in June 1960, and in September 1965, he was pitching in the major leagues. Yeah, he was that good. He pitched 2 games in September as an 18-year-old. He won both games, pitched very, very well, and ultimately went on to 13, 14 years, full seasons in an all-star recognition. A very good, very good.
Then he became the voice for the Red Sox.
You're thinking of a different Coleman.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Ken Coleman, yeah. But the other part of the story, and it's probably more interesting, is his father, Joe Coleman Sr., was a pitcher for the Philadelphia Athletics and pitched credibly for about 10 years in the major leagues. And Joe Coleman Jr.'s son, Joe Coleman III, pitched for the Chicago Cubs, briefly, not at the same level as his father and grandfather, but the important point is the whole history of Major League Baseball, going back to 1871, there have only been 5 cases of a grandfather, father, and grandson, all 3 of them playing at the Major League level. So they're one of 5. And I think you'd immediately think of the Boones, because Aaron Boone was such a thorn in our side. And his grandfather, Ike Boone, played for the Red Sox briefly, and his father, Bob Boone, was a catcher for the Phillies. So it's pretty interesting that family produced 3 generations. And I'm told that there's a Boone in the 4th generation who might.
I'm sorry, I have to go to physical therapy.
Well, that's perfectly fine. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
So now we come back to Tony C. Such a sad case in the sense I said he's 1964 and about 19. There he was, the regular center fielder for the Red Sox, and he was the youngest player in the history of the American League to have 100 career home runs, and everything about him was greatness. And in the middle of August of 1967, he was hit by a fastball, and Rico Petrocelli, most of you will know his name, he was on deck, and he told me, he said, I ran to him immediately. He said, I thought he was dying. I thought he was dead. He was very, very seriously injured, and again went to Santa Maria, and eventually he missed the rest of the 67 season, all of the 1968 season, but came back in 1969 and was a comeback player of the year. And in 1970, he actually had his best statistical year. But I didn't get to interview Tony because he had passed away, but I got to interview his 2 brothers. And they said that Tony had no sight in one eye. The eye, actually, he was right-handed. He couldn't see, and they knew that because they threw batting practice to him over and over and over, and they could see there was a spot where he didn't even react. And it was very clear that if he had some vision, he did not have appropriate vision for a Major League Baseball player, but against all odds, he managed to come back and be successful. Unfortunately, he had a heart attack in, I think it was 1991, right around there. Still a young guy. And his career actually ended in 1972. He tried to come back in 1975. He was such an athlete that he actually did make the team and come north to the Red Sox and play for about a month. But most of his teammates and most people who know what they're talking about say he would have been a Hall of Famer. And obviously, there aren't an awful lot of those around. So, it's again kind of ironic. You had 2, legendary high school athletes, Harry Giannis and Tony, who went to high school with Lynn and went on to play for the Red Sox. And tragically, their career, and in Harry's case, his life was cut short while he was playing. Now, everybody knows Jerry. In fact, the last I knew, he was living in Wayland. I'm not sure that he still is.
No.
No? And I think most of you know that he's had a reoccurrence of the cancer, which he's beat up. And so he's a fighter, and if it can be done, he'll be the guy to do it. He's, I think, 68. And he was a very good second baseman, first for the California Angels, and then longer with the Boston Red Sox. He made one All-Star team. And when I interviewed him, he was already an announcer. You know, most of these guys I interviewed 5, 10 years after they've retired. And in his case, he was announcing the Red Sox game, and he had been for a while. And he said, you know, the first 3 months that I did that job, I was terrible. And I remember listening, he's right, he was awful. But I said, no, these are Jerry's words. If I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it right. And I've got a coach, you know, to work with me. And Ned Martin, who a lot of you remember, is just a great announcer. Jerry said Ned was the guy who really helped me get over that. Now, of course, he's a legend. The most interesting thing he said was, I always remind myself that I'm going into people's home. And I'm going into their living room or their family room. And I think about when people come to visit me, how do I want them or like them to behave? And he said, definitely not a know-it-all, definitely not loud, definitely not dominating things. And he said, I try to present myself as the guest that everybody would be happy to have sitting in their living room or family room, dining room. And I think if you reflect on it, that's pretty much what he's been able to do. He's talking like you and I all talk, and of course very insightful. So let's all have a good time. He grew up in Somerset, which most of you know is near like Fall River and New Bedford area. And all of these guys said the same thing. You know, Jerry and most of them signed right out of high school. He said, went to spring training, and we were the greatest baseball player in our county. And all of a sudden we look around, and the other 19 guys were the best baseball player in their county. And you realize how tough it is to make your way from the lowest minor to the major leagues. Rich Gedman grew up in Worcester, went to, I think it was St. Peter's High School in Worcester. And when he finished high school, you know, they have an annual draft, and 30 teams draft 50 rounds, it's 1,500 players. And nobody drafted Rich Gedman, nobody wanted him. But a Red Sox scout saw potential there. And he had been kind of a fat third baseman who was a good hitter, but not a great hitter. And Billy Eno said, we're going to make you a catcher. And he persuaded the Red Sox to sign him, which, you know, ordinarily you don't sign undrafted players. And over 4 or 5 years working through the minor league system, he ended up with the Red Sox. He made an all-star team, had a nice career. He's now the hitting coach for the Woo Sox. Oh. Did I say that right? The Woo Sox. And he's been a hitting coach in the Red Sox system for at least 15 years. And I've gotten to know him very well, very, very nice. He's a guy next door, you know, different. In fact, he lived in Framingham when he broke into the Red Sox, and I believe he's still in the same house. But a really, really decent, good guy. So, you know, we haven't had as many, all the names we've looked at so far are pretty well-known players. Not so much Lou Maloney, although, you know, he grew up in Framingham, and I think most of us remember he had a nice little career. And Manny Del Carmen grew up in West Roxbury, and he was a very solid reliever for the Red Sox and a couple of other teams for 5 or 6 years. So they, you know, they weren't all stars. They're not going into even the Red Sox Hall of Fame, but it's tough for the local kids. You know, and they all said the same thing. You know, Pudge Fisk said we had a 20-game schedule. You know, he grew up in northwest New Hampshire. And we usually get to play about 14 of those games because it was snowing or too cold. He said, we go into the minors and we're competing with young men from Arizona, California, Texas, Florida, who've been playing 60, 70, 80 high school games. So, you know, they start out at a real disadvantage, but obviously it can be overcome. So, those are our local guys, and you know, at this point, I'd love to hear any and all of your questions.
Did Russ Halloran ever make Red Sox or just the Red Sox minor?
Yeah, I know he didn't make the Red Sox, or if he did, I wasn't paying attention. It was great. Is this a local?
Yeah, he grew up in Newton.
Grew up in Newton. And it's H-A-L-L?
H-A-L-L, yeah, Halloran.
Yeah. As far as I know.
Every once in a while, you'll see it from the Globe, somebody will interview because of something that occurred at the Red Sox. And I thought he would made the minor leagues. I didn't know if he ever got to the team itself.
Right. You know, 1 in 10 of the young men who sign actually even get to the big leagues to have an at-bat or appear in free games. And 1 in 20 really have a career. It depends on how you define a career. I guess, you know, if you're in the bigs for 5 or more years, that's not shabby. There's some really, really good players in AAA and AA, and sometimes it's just, you know, if they have 6 terrific catches in the system and you're a catcher, which is what Rich Gedman said to me, we're really competing with somebody in AA and AAA and so on. So it's really, really, really tough. You know, it's a big deal. The local kid gets drafted in the 5th round. Everybody's all excited. Chances he's actually going to make the majors. Because the 1st and 2nd rounds get all the preference because they've paid them a lot of money. And the scouts have gone out on a limb and said, this kid's got it. He's going to be playing for us in 5 years. So they get a chance to make mistakes with the 5th round and certainly the 15th. But, you know, God bless them. Some of them just power their way right through. You know, usually it takes a break of some sort. I mean, Rich was undrafted, so he wasn't even the 50th round. It can be done, but it's pretty tough. Other question? Yes.
I had heard, and I wonder if it's true, that Ted Williams loved Dudley Pond as one of his favorite fishing places.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that because I forgot the Babe Ruth connection with Whalen, which in the Prohibition era, the Babe had a farm in Sudbury. He didn't do much farming, but it was a big. And during the Prohibition, he would go to the chateau, knock on the door, they'd let him in. But the rest of the story is, after he had a few pops, he would drive over to Natick to Wilson Street to visit with Tom Conley. If you may recall, I mentioned he was the first American League umpire. And, and so apparently the Babe would appear at the door and Tom said, I'm an umpire, you're a player, we shouldn't. And the Babe said, oh, forget about that, Tom, and walked his way into the living room. But the great story is there was a game and Babe Ruth was at bat and Tom is behind the plate and Tom goes, strike one, and the Babe thought it was a little bit high. So he stepped back out and he said, Tom, young Tommy must be, what, about this tall now? Because the crowd thinks he's saying that's where the pitch was. And give it to him, Babe, give him to him. So he steps back in. And there's another pitch. And, you know, it's wide of the plate as far as the Babe, but Tom says, strike 2. He backs out and he said, did I tell you about the fish I caught in Dudley Pond? It was about this big. And again, the fans all think that he's given at the time about the pitch call in South Carolina. You get in there, you big SOB, or I'm going to throw you out of the ball game. Now, I said it's original quote. It's somebody who was a very dear friend who has since passed away. Had a dry cleaning room, apparently in the 30s or 40s. Dry cleaning got delivered to your house. So in any event, my pal was a great fan. He always leave Tom for last. And sometimes Tom would say, thank you, Charlie. And sometimes, hey, come on in, because he knew how much Charlie loved baseball. So Tom told Charlie that story. Charlie told it to me. And to the best of my knowledge, that's the only source for that particular. But yeah, I know Ted did fish there. Knowing what I do know about Ted and fishing, I'd be surprised if Ted thought that was
A good one, okay.
yeah. It doesn't do anybody any harm to say, I've been in London.
Yeah.
Has everybody been to the Chateau?
Uh-huh.
Right?
Yeah.
Everybody, you have to go to the Chateau.
I've never been there.
No. Well, all right. Let's all go there for lunch. Well, it hasn't changed at all in the 40 years.
Except they now have a patio.
Yeah.
They have outside dining
I
patio.
didn't realize that.
Yeah.
I haven't been that much lately. I tell you, the hamburgers are as good as any you'll ever have. Other questions you might have?
Well, thank you so much, Herb. This was really wonderful. A round of applause.
Thank you.
Such interesting stories. It's really fascinating. So thank you so much for coming again today.
Happy to.
And we look forward to having you come back again next year.
Yeah, that'd be nice. I'd like that.
Thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thanks for coming. I really enjoyed
Have you written a
it.
book as yet, Herb?
I'm sorry?
Have you written some books?
Yeah. I've written 3 Red Sox books. 2 of them related. The first one, Lightning in a Bottle, Sox of '67. Red Sox Heroes is a composite of 40 of the feature articles that I had published in the Red Sox program. And I took those and updated them and expanded them a little bit. So that's they're like 10 or 12 page biographies.
Yeah.
And people seem to like it.
Yeah, that
And then,
sounds good. And then what?
And then I just came out with the book, The Impossible Just came out. It's amazing how time flies, isn't it? Right? It came out in 2017. So that's a little while ago, isn't it?
And what's the name of that one? The Impossible?
The Impossible Dream.
Dream, okay.
Red Sox 1967. And I've gotten to know, as I mentioned, I got to know Billy Mambo Cat and a few others. The players I'm closest to are the '67 guys, because they're all about my age.
Yeah.
Yaz is 3 years older, Rico Petroselli's a day older, and Mike Andrews, and on and on and on.
Yeah.
They, at this point, they're almost all 75 to 81, let's say.
Yeah.
And so, well, Jim Longborg was my dentist before I ever wrote
There you
a
go.
word. And when I wrote that first book, Lightning in a Bottle, he really introduced me to, and provided me with credibility. I've never written anything, so I certainly needed him. And I'm still writing for the program. Things are in a kind of a funny place.
Okay.
They published the program and it just had pictures and ads and, rosters and statistics.
Yeah.
I have, and I'm writing a second article. Red Sox actually have a magazine for the former players. And it is really, really nicely done. Come back next year, I'll bring a couple of lunch. There's a nice glossy magazine. And
I'll see you next Wednesday. Give me a call.
very, very nicely done. And I have written a number of articles for that. You know, the Red Sox, people say, the Red Sox, you ought to sell that. People love it. They said, no, because the players are pretty honest in what they have to say, because they know only former players and their loved ones are going to be reading it. If we sold it, we'd be taking that away from them, as well as, you know, they wouldn't be as honest. You know, credit to them. They could make a lot of money. It's very, very nice.
Yeah.
And, as I say, if I come back next year, I'll bring a few along. But, you know, talking to former players, the way I do, and a lot of them have played for 2 or 3, even 4 or more teams, say that's the only thing of its kind, you know. They'll say, I played for the Twins for 4 years and I get a Christmas card. The Red Sox twice a year send me this nicely done magazine, just intended for us as former players. And nobody else even comes close.
So you're not able to really acquire a magazine at this point?
You can't buy them.
Can't buy
They're not
them.
for sale.
Yeah.
It's really nice. And it's fun to, it's fun. I
Nice
wrote
idea.
an article on the 1986 team and interviewed Roger Clemens and of course Rich Gedman and half a dozen players from that team. Yeah, it's fun. And now I'm writing one about different eras, the 1950s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. It's quite an undertaking, but it also allows me to talk to Ken Harrells and Dwight Evans. And it's always fun.
I saw a recent TV interview with Roger Clemens, and said that his son is playing now in the pros, right?
Yeah. I think there were 4 of them. All with the first name beginning with K, as in K for strikeout.
Oh, wow.
Go figure, right?
Yeah.
How Roger is, huh? Have an ego and all that?
Yes.
But I think a couple of these kids were pretty good players, and it wouldn't surprise me if one of them is still
play. I forget which team they said it was.
Yeah. And I know you all have other things to do, but to me, I got to know you as a little bit, and obviously all his teammates. The fact that his grandson has turned into a very successful. You know, he was on the All-Star team, and there were some issues with, his son, my father, and so it's nice that he can have some success and enjoyment. The young man was with the Orioles for 7 years in the minor league system, and they barely gave him a chance, and the Giants picked him up, and he's turned into a very, very good player. That's good for you.
Yeah, good for him.
Well, thank you
Thank you
again. I
very much.
really enjoyed
Thank you.
talking to you. Went over all these little facts. I really did. Yes. One triggers another and another.
Now, do you have any of your cards to give out again? Any of your business cards?
Oh, I don't think I do.
I think I still have one at home. Okay.
Yeah. If you Google me, there were, I don't know, 5,000 entries or something.
Okay.
Most of them, it turns out, really about herbs.
Oh, there you go, a secondary interest. Okay.
So Herb, I like that last picture. Did you take that picture?
No, it's a stock
that's
picture
nice.
that we picked up, and it's kind of a nice,
Yeah.
it's generic, so it's not fun. Yeah, it
Do you
is.
need a ride?
No, but thanks for asking.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thanks so much.
And I'm
Wonderful.
nice to meet you.
Always.
How everybody